Welcome to Divisionalysis. I'm Fog. I've been waiting to do this for quite some time, and that's to find out how much weapon damage talents actually add to our build, and which one is best for each weapon. Let's go. So there are a lot of weapon talents. And if we're going to compare them, we're going to need to put them on a build. And because weapon talents fall into only a few categories, it's relatively easy to put a build together in order to compare them. And what we're going to base this on is a purely generic build set. Now that generic build set will have 100% all weapon damage, which is 10% from my watch and 6 red cores. And then we're going to do an average of 40% assault rifle damage. So 140% total. And that 140% or that extra 40% would normally be 30% coming from the weapon and your specialization, but then I've allowed for 10% on some builds that are going to include assault rifle damage, but also maybe an average of 10% expertise on a weapon as well. So it's not really going to make that much difference. 130 to 140, but when it does make a difference, I'll definitely point that out. The build is going to be 153% crit hit damage and 59% crit chance, and that is to allow some room to maneuver for our crit chance, crit damage weapon talents. But this is also what you can achieve with a high-end build, and that will give us an average crit damage output of 90.27. And if I compare that to the current damage meta that we're trying to get to the bottom of, you can see that with Coyote's Mask, the average damage output for the Strikers build at the moment is very, very close to that. So representing a good, solid average, which is what we want from a control. Now when it comes to damage to armor, damage to health, and damage to targets out of cover, it doesn't matter. There is no talents that affect any of those characteristics, so we can ignore them completely. But something that we can't ignore is our specialization, and the specialization that provides us with the highest damage return, because that's what we're trying to get to the bottom of, is the damage meta, and that specialization is Gunner. That comes as no surprise to the majority of people, I am sure. Provides us 5% rate of fire on kill. It gives us an additional 10% weapon handling, and it also grants every third reload at 50% reload speed. Or it's not 50% of your reload time, it is 50% reload speed. And what that works out to be is essentially a 33% time reduction on every third reload. So our control build starts with its 100 base, whatever weapon that is, it doesn't really matter, it's always going to be 100% of its base. And then we're going to be adding 90.27% crit damage output. And it's going to have 140% weapon damage. So our control over base is returning 456.65% damage output with 6 red cores and everything rolled to crit chance, crit damage. Now, just a reminder that doesn't matter which order I do those in, the overall percentage output will be exactly the same. What we're concerned about is what goes in to these 3 boxes, whether that is a talent that provides you weapon damage, whether it's a talent that provides you crit chance or crit damage, or whether it is a talent that provides you another bucket of damage altogether, amplified damage, or a unique damage multiplier, which is different from the rest of the buckets. Now the first 2 that we're going to look at comes directly from this bucket, and that is the amplified weapon damage talents. Those are Flatline and Ranger. Flatline providing 15% to pulsed enemies, and Ranger amplifying weapon damage by 2% for every 5 meters that you're away from a target. Now, when it comes to talents, any of them, There is always an if and then. So if a target is pulsed, then you will get 15% damage. If a target is 5 meters away, then you will get 2%. So these are some of the things that we're going to be looking at. Just terminology moving forward. So we'll start with Ranger actually, because it's one of the easiest to work out. Average engagement distance for heroic missions is 15-25 meters, which means at 15 through to 20 we're going to be getting 6% amplified damage, and from 20 to 25 it's going to be 8%. So on average we're going to run with 7% amplified damage. And we plug that on top of our control build, then we end up with an end result of 488.62% output. We'll get to what that represents soon. But now when we move to Flatline. Now Flatline is generally, most people will use Technician to access the laser pointer. And what that means is that anything that you point your weapon at is going to be pulsed, and so it's 100% activation time. So the if part becomes a 100% uptime factor. What that does though is when you look at all the weapons, the blue is the weapons that can access Flatline. The orange box denotes those weapons that can actually attach the linked laser pointer, which requires a long underbarrel. And when we use the underbarrel attachment for the linked laser pointer, we also lose our crit chance attachment. So our 59% crit chance, 153% crit damage, which was putting out 90.27% crit damage, means that we lose our 5% crit chance attachment to the weapon in order to place that underbarrel on. So we go down to 54, 153, or what is a better configuration, 60% crit chance and 141% crit hit damage for an 84.6% crit damage output. So now, when we do the maths, 84.6% crit damage, 140% weapon damage, and our 15% amplified damage, the output for Flatline is now 509.5%. So Flatline versus Ranger, it very much looks like Flatline is the winner, but there are some other adjustments that need to be made. When we took on Technician, we lost Gunner, and we lost our 5% rate of fire, and also our every third reload being at 66% its original speed. And when it comes to damage, damage is calculated, or damage per second is calculated by damage over time. Now that comes from damage over the time it takes you to fire and your reloading time. So if we have our 100% damage being our control, and then we have 100% of the firing time and 100% of the reloading time being the control. So that is worked out based on an average for all weapons, and there is some variance here. But across all the assault rifles, when we're doing multi-target damage or doing large target damage, the assault rifles on average will be firing for 4 seconds, and then their average reload time will be 2.1 seconds. For single targets, on average we'll be firing for 3 seconds, and our average tac reload will be 1.71 seconds. Now my initial research for all red builds suggests that we will be doing multi-target DPS 35% of the time, and single target DPS around 65% of the time. All in all, if we're going to use a generic assault rifle for all of the talents, it means that we are firing for 65% of the time and reloading for 35% of the time. And although there is some variation depending on your weapon selection, generally a faster firing weapon will also have a lower reload time. So the percentages stay roughly the same, but I will do the exact calculations at the end of the series. But for now, our control is 65% firing, 35% reloading. So that distribution now becomes 100% of our damage is now divided by 65% of our firing time and 35% of our reloading time. So if we have a Flatline at 509.5% damage, the firing time is now increased by 5% because we've lost our 5% rate of fire bonus on kill. And our reloading time, because we were getting a 33% reduction over every 3 reloads, our reloading time is now at 111%, what the average for all the other weapons using gunner is. And when we apply the 65-35 percentages, that means that at delivering damage, Flatline with Technician is 7% slower at delivering that 509.5% damage. And so now damage over time becomes 509.5% damage over 107% of the average time to deliver. Ranger was 488.62% damage over the average. It still retains gunner, so it's 100% time as compared to the control, so that gives us 488%. There's no change there. For Flatline, 509.5% damage over 107% of the time to deliver it means that that comes down to 476.17% actual return. And when you do the calculations, that means that Ranger is delivering as it says on the box with a 7% output on average for its return amplified, whereas Flatline is now actually delivering only a real 4.27% return using Technician and not taking gunner. But there are some qualitative and quantitative benefits for doing so. And this is another factor to damage and damage talents and effectiveness in game. Flatline and Ranger are both very easy to use talents. If you're using Technician, it's literally point and shoot. You just have to have a long underbarrel to access the laser. And for Ranger, it's point and shoot. It just depends on the distance. The value, we've lost some by taking Technician, but we've also gained some. We might have lost weapon handling and our rate of fire and our reload, but what we've also gained is an additional skill tier, and we've also gained 12% amplified damage to tech, robots, turrets, etc. So there are those other additional benefits that need to be weighed up. When it comes to Ranger, the qualitative advantages is that it's probably going to be more value by playing Legendary, for instance, because the average engagement distance is going to be further out, and you could be accessing up to 4% additional amplified damage in that difficulty type. But what it also means, being distance dependent, is that enemies that are closer to you are presenting a much larger threat on average. And Ranger provides less damage when the enemy is closer to you. Another qualitative point that needs to be considered when considering talents. Now, if we go back to Flatline and we don't take Technician, instead we stick with our gunner, what we're trying to do is access 15% worth of amplified damage, which means that we need an alternate source of pulse. Well, the thing about Flatline is that after 3 kills, you access that ability to pulse. It's self-proccing, which means that without any other additional source, 1 in every 4 targets is going to provide you that full 15% value, which roughly works out to be 3.75%, almost as much as what it was providing with 100% uptime, which is not terribly true, but we'll get to that in a second. There are also other talents as well which are exactly the same as what Flatline is, in that these talents are providing you a full amplified damage whenever these are active. Now, although it says plus 20% weapon damage for each of Eyeless, Ignited and Sadist, and 30% for Thunderstruck, although it's worded as 30% extra damage in the case of Thunderstruck, these are in fact unique talent categories. These are impact damage categories. So exactly the same as what damage to target out of cover is, or damage to armor, or damage to health. These are unique multipliers. In the case of Ignited, Eyeless and Sadist, just like in the case of Flatline, it has self-proccing capabilities. Thunderstrike does not, and it provides you extra damage as a compensation for that. Ignited, Eyeless and Sadist are 20%, whereas Flatline is only 15%, but they are self-proccing less often than what Flatline is. Flatline after 3 kills, these status effect talents being after 4 kills. Now we could average this out and say, for instance, in Flatline's case 3.75%, in the case of Ignited, Eyeless and Sadist, that these self-proccing capabilities amount to 4% amplified damage. But that's not really the case. These talents, you have to activate them and then shoot the target, but the self-proccing itself, it's not averaged at all. The self-proccing applies to a single target only. And that can make a very big difference as far as the value of those talents is concerned. A more effective tactic is actually to devote a skill to activating those talents. If you can get the skill to activate those talents and proc that talent, well then you are going to access the full value of that amplified damage to every one of those targets. But now your total damage output is completely tied to your ability to activate that talent and then to proc it on a target. Now for Eyeless, you are limited to the Blinder Firefly, although you could potentially look at something like Trauma as a proccing mechanism. For Bleed, you have the Mortar Turret, the Explosive Seeker, and you also have the Hive, which will generate bleed. For Fire, you have the Chem, and you also have the Incinerator Turret, and also the Fire Sticky. For Shock, you literally have shock traps, or potentially the St. Elmos, but that would require swapping weapons. In the case of Fire, Shock and Bleed, you also have the advantage that some of the environmental hazards will also proc these status effects as well. And for Pulse, you have a number of options as well. You have the Remote Pulse, you have the Scanner Pulse, you have the Scanner Drone, but you would obviously lose Gunner again. But then you also have the Pulse from Gunner itself, which will also generate the same damage output, as well as providing you with a status effect, which for all the other Pulse types is lacking. Now in the case of a 6 red build, you can actually have your Pulse up approximately 50% of the time if you include the duration, although it doesn't really work out to be 50% of enemies. It will roughly equate to around about that, especially when you add in the self-proccing characteristics that Flatline brings. So it is entirely possible that if you do denote a skill, even without any variation or improvement on the skill's efficiency, that you could potentially have 50% access to all of the damage offered by Flatline. But once again, you're devoting a skill, and the effectiveness of Flatline is tied directly to you doing so. There are in fact combinations with, for instance, the Night Watcher mask, where you can actually have effectively 100% uptime on your Pulse, even on a 6 red build. And so we might look at build combinations involving that later on down the track. But in every case, the activation of the conditions, the activation of the if, requires sacrifices in some other portion of the build. In the case of Flatline and Sadist, however, there are specific gear sets that can assist with self-proccing. Heartstopper for Heartbreaker, every single time you apply a headshot to a target, you are now applying the pulse to that target. In addition to the self-proccing characteristics of Flatline. With regards to ongoing directive, hollow point ammo and the self-production of hollow point ammo applies bleeds to a target, and therefore in conjunction with Sadist's self-proccing capabilities can drastically increase the number of enemies that you are now dealing the full value of your amplified damage to. But the ultimate meta when it comes to these talents is to have a teammate activate that talent for you and you just do the shooting, in which case you are getting the full value from the whole amplified damage that's available on that talent, which in the case of some of these talents is quite significant. The difficulty comes from activating these specific talents. So all of these things add into the value of the talent itself. And although it is possible to access between 15 and 30% amplified damage with these impact and status effect talents, outside of specific build types and potentially team play, on average for solo play, it is Ranger that is providing the highest average damage. And at this point in time, across Heroic at least, we're looking at a 7% improvement to the results for the weapons that have a blue box next to them. At the end, I will assess what is the largest damage output talent for every one of these weapons and how much that damage represents, and we will re-rank at the end a tier list from top to bottom of the strongest weapons and talent combinations. There's still a lot of talents to go through. Join me on the next one. Subscribe, like if you liked it, and I will see you in the next one. Fog out.